My name is Brian Noble. I'm the chair of Computer Science and Engineering, and I'm really excited about today's talk. Our Dow lecturer today is Dr. Telle Whitney, advocate for and an expert on diversity in computer science. The Dow Distinguished Lectureship is the highest external honor bestowed by the EECS department. It enables us to bring extremely prominent and accomplished individuals such as Dr. Whitney to our campus. The lectureship was established by donations from students and friends of William Gould Dow, a former faculty member and a chair of our department. Professor Dow was a scientist, educator, and inventor during his 38 active years at Michigan from 1926 to 1964. He was largely responsible for creating and organizing at least 13 different laboratories and research units. He also introduced a number of innovative areas of study to the curriculum, including vacuum tubes, nuclear theory, solid-state devices, and computer engineering. I'm really personally honored to welcome Telle Whitney as our Dow lecturer. We had an outstanding conversation this morning with the Department Executive Committee about issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, as did a number of other groups in the department. And I'd now like, for the formal introduction, to ask Professor Valeria Bacacco, Thurnau Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and the Associate Dean for Academic Programs and Initiatives at the Rackham School of Graduate Studies to formally introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome everybody, and welcome to all the students. I'm very excited today to introduce Dr. Telle Whitney, who will speak as part of the William Gould Dow Lecture Series. Dr. Telle Whitney began her career at the center of the VLSI revolution. So in her PhD work and in the company she joined afterwards, she developed key technology to design silicon chips that are the basis for how we do computer systems today. And as part of that, she also worked in a startup tech company called Malleable Technology, where she was a VP of engineering. And she created and scaled up the entire engineering team for that. Now, your average Silicon Valley engineer at that point would slowly transition into early retirement, but not Telle. Telle went on to become a pioneer on addressing the challenge of inclusiveness in technology. So together with Anita Borg, Telle Whitney in 1994 started the Grace Hopper Celebration of Women in Technology Conference. The first time in June 1994, there were 500 women in technology attending the conference. And Telle said that when she first walked into that room and there were all those women in technology, that was a life-changing experience. And so they did it again and again and again. And last year, the Grace Hopper Celebration had 17,000 women in attendance. That's the largest gathering worldwide for women in computing. So Anita Borg and Telle Whitney in 1997 also started the Institute for Women in Technology, which then became the Anita Borg Institute for Women in Technology. Telle led the Institute from 2002 to 2017, just 6 months ago, as the CEO and the president. And during her tenure, she led the Institute to drastically increase the size and the programming that the Institute was offering. They managed the Grace Hopper Conference. They started the Women of Vision Award. They started an award that is called the Anita Borg Award for Top Company for Women in Tech. They also started Tech Women and an exchange program and mentorship for women in technology. But that was not enough. So in 2004, Telle, with other co-founder, also started the National Center for Women in Information Technology. And that is a consortium, a gathering of academic institutions, companies, nonprofits, government organizations worldwide. There are 1,100 members who have a common goal of promoting the participation of girls and women in computing and technology. So Telle received several awards, an ACM Distinguished Service Award, an honorary degree for Carnegie Mellon University, and today she serves in a number of advisory boards and advisory councils, and she speaks often about diversity like she's going to do with us today. She received a master and a PhD degree from Caltech and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Utah. So, in this cold April day, help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Telle Whitney.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. So is it on? Okay. Well, so it's a real honor and a privilege to be here. I'm very passionate about technology. Technology is changing our world. When I was a graduate student, I had the real pleasure to be involved in what was called then the VLSI revolution, where a lot of very smart people, including Lynn Conway, who is one of the great icons of this revolution, which is right, she's right here, had this vision of taking what was then the transistor technology and applying system-level principles and scaling up. It was a really exciting time. And even when I was in graduate school, I saw the vision of taking VLSI and making it ubiquitous. I've seen it happen. You know, my computer has a chip, of course. My iPad and iPhone has a chip, of course. But my car has over 100 processors in it. There are processors that can be injected into your pet. They're on clothing. I mean, it is everywhere. And so you can see the trajectory of that kind of technology revolution and the excitement and the impact that it's had on every one of you. And so as you look at where we stand today and look at what the potential is for technology, we're sitting in that same space. Artificial intelligence, which has been around for a long time, but as you look at the future and what's possible, artificial intelligence in certainly all the devices that we talk to, and our home devices, in law, in medicine, in government overall, we're sitting at that same space as we start, and we see what the potential is. And artificial intelligence is just one of the many technologies that is launching today. But for technologies like artificial intelligence, you also see the ethics and the potential consequences, some of which are negative, in the field of AI or blockchain or some of the other exciting new technologies. And we want all people, everyone, to be at the table creating this technology that's going to change our lives. We absolutely want half the population, women, other underrepresented groups, to be there as we grapple with this new and really exciting technologies. So I'm going to start by telling you first about my story and my journey as to where I got to today, and then broaden that, talk a bit about the landscape for today and changes that we can make both in academia and in industry. When I got to the University of Utah, a long time ago, I knew that I wanted to do something big. And so I started in theater, thought that's where I wanted to be. Didn't work out. I then moved to politics, didn't work out. I had no exposure to anything STEM related, even though I was a math whiz in high school. And so I ended up taking an inventory test, really almost reluctantly, as I tried to figure out what might my interest, where does my interest lie? And I found programming. I took my first programming class. By the way, my first professor was a woman. The faculty in the department had a number of women. The graduate students there were women. And I felt like I found my home. I knew that this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Now, computer science looked a lot different in those days. That computer on the screen was an actual Sperry Univac that I worked on. We programmed by taking very large card decks and turning them into the programming office and getting big listings. So it was a little different world. But what wasn't different then was this excitement about the potential and what was possible in computer science. I was very lucky because one of the faculty at the University of Utah noticed my work and introduced me to people who were starting a graduate department at Caltech. And I went off to Caltech to get a PhD. I didn't really know that I wanted a PhD. I actually was pretty sure when I went to Caltech that I didn't want a PhD. But I knew that there was it was a chance of a lifetime. And there was many brilliant people at Caltech. So I just packed up and I went there. Now, what was happening at Caltech, the person on the screen is Carver Mead, who was my PhD thesis advisor and remains a close friend. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this whole revolution happening. There was a lot of work between Caltech and Xerox PARC, who was just spearheaded by Lynn Conway. And we, as students, were thinking about how do you create this silicon that will change our lives? And we were aware that this could change our lives. Now, at Caltech, it was 13% women. And so even though I wouldn't have been able to talk about it, I wouldn't have even known that it was because I was a woman, I actually just felt a level of discomfort there. I loved the innovation, but I wasn't quite sure if I belonged. And so when I arrived in Silicon Valley, which is the Bay Area in California, I brought with me my passion for technology, but I was also desperate to meet other women. I really set out that first year to find as many technical women as was possible. And it was during those early years in the Bay Area that I met my good friend Anita Borg. She had just moved to the Bay Area, she'd just moved to Silicon Valley, and she and other women around that same time, we would come together to just be with each other. I mean, I worked in the semiconductor industry. There were just not many women around. And so having some friends who were women made a huge difference as I started down my entrepreneurial journey. And I can't stress enough that from a technical perspective, I loved my work. I loved making a contribution. I just at times felt like there wasn't, that there might be a little bit more in terms of the people side of it. And so she and I together created the Grace Hopper Celebration in 1994, which Valeria mentioned. Now, so she and I had created this, and we had created it from scratch. I'd talked to all the speakers, so I knew all about it. But when Anita and I were standing on this balcony of the hotel in Washington, D.C., and we saw this sea of people coming into the conference, it was really more women than I had ever seen in my entire life. And so this excitement of being able to listen to these remarkable women was just, it was life-changing. That first Grace Hopper celebration for me was life-changing. So it was 500 people. This is the Grace Hopper celebration today. It's the reason that it has grown, it was 18,000 people this last year, is because so many women who work in industries where they are still just a very few come together and have the chance to celebrate the success, to learn from each other. It's about 5% men. And of the men that attend the conference, it's a chance to experience what many of their colleagues experience every day. Just to give you an example of what it's like for some people, I'm going to tell you the story of Ashley Kennard and Anushka Anand. Ashley went to DePauw University in Ohio. She was a freshman, and the university had a great organization for bringing freshman-level women to the Grace Hopper celebration. She wasn't really sure she wanted to study computer science, but she went to the conference and came back having had a life-changing experience. She started mobilizing some people at DePauw. They reached out to local high school students, and she built on the momentum while remaining committed to computer science. Ashley used the Grace Hopper celebration at key inflection points in her life. She came back as a senior as she was grappling with what was next. And after attending the conference, realized by hearing some people speak at the conference that what she really wanted to do was a joint major between biology and computing. And she's now a PhD student at Brown in biology and computing, working on cancer research. Anushka Anand first came to the conference when she was a PhD student, and she was the only person from the University of Illinois in Chicago who came to the conference. And she loved the people she met, and so she went back to her school and she organized a group of people to come to the subsequent conference. She arranged for the financing. She really led that effort. She graduated and went to Tableau Software, and once again, she came to the first conference from Tableau as the only person from Tableau, but then went back and organized a group of people to come. Each of them used the conference during key transitions in their life to seek advice and to find what others are doing. Look for role models, connection, inspiration, and guidance. Well, so you ask, where are we? I mean, I'm an engineer. I like to start with data. So it's important to look at the landscape. So first of all, you want to look at women. And of the following slides, this comes from the IPED database, which is a massive database that looks at representation of different groups. This is nonprofit universities, computer science broadly, so it's not engineering, and it's from 1987 to 2015. And in 2015, about 20% of the undergraduates were women, and this is graduation rate, so this is not enrollment, this is graduation rates. About 20%. Getting better. You can see that the numbers are going up, but that they don't come close to the numbers of 1987, when it was well over 35% women. If you look at different minorities, you want to first break down between white and non-white. I'm not going to spend any time here because we're going to focus in on that bottom part of the slide and look at different races, because different groups have very different results. And there's a lot of change that's happening. So, for example, within African Americans, today we're at about 8%. And you can see that whereas it's been going up slightly, we're not nearly where we were just a few years ago. But it is going up slightly, so that's the optimist in me. For Hispanics, which started much lower than African Americans back in 1987, it has been growing steadily. And currently we're about, I think it's 11%. And finally, for underrepresented minorities, and underrepresented minorities are used a term to mean groups that are represented differently than the population. And when you hear that term, it means African American, Hispanic, and American Indian. Now, American Indian are small in number, even though you see it looks big on this graph. This is, on the original graph, it was the one right at the bottom. So they're just very small in numbers. You do not see a lot of American Indian. And as you can see, it has also not gone up. It's really stayed pretty flat. So that's where we are in terms of the student population. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about industry. This is reported diversity numbers. So many companies these days actually report their diversity numbers. There's, from an engineering perspective, it's not absolutely consistent the way that they report different companies, but it still gives you a measure to look at. And as you look for a job, this is something that you want to look at. Because here's the truth. There is huge variance between companies. We know what we can do. And so you have companies like ThoughtWorks, which is on your left, which is over 35% women. ThoughtWorks has been very systematic about the ways in which they recruit women, and not just women, everybody. The way that they integrate them into the culture, the way that they talk about the culture. It's it's well above the normal. They've won the top companies, Anita Borg top companies for women technologists the last couple of years. And then there's way over on the right, which is Twitter, which is less than 15%. And these numbers are for 2016, and they will vary a lot from year to year. But my message is to you, there's a lot of variance. You need to understand what companies are doing. And you don't want to just hear the words. You want to look at the results. You want to know what does the commitment mean? And I'm going to talk more about that. The other way, the lens to look at women in industry is through how it goes up the ladder. So this data comes from the Anita Borg Top Companies Award. And so it only represents the 63 participating companies, although it's probably better than all the rest of the companies, but it has, this is not a graph of all companies. And you can see that at the entry level, numbers have gone up, that there's been a huge recruiting effort to bring women into companies, but that they are not represented in mid and senior and executive, and that it has consistently gone down. And you can see that this has happened for a lot of years. You see this kind of trend. This is what's happening. So that's the landscape. It gives you a real sense of where we are, students, industry. Of course, there's other numbers, but that's what I'm going to start with. And so the real question is, what can we do? We want to start with K through 12. If you've worked in this area as long as I have, you hear about the pipeline, how important the pipeline is. How can you embed students if they're not there? And there has been a real phase shift in terms of K through 12 programs that have brought computing to K through 12 schools. Remember when I said that I started at the University of Utah? Well, I'd love to say that I didn't have any clue that STEM is something that I wanted to do. Well, it isn't just because that was a long time ago. Many students who are very good at math or very good at analytics get to college and have zero exposure to what engineering or computer science can do. And so there's a real effort right now to take computing and bring it to expose students in high school to what computing is. Code.org is this remarkable organization that has grown up over the last few years, that has worked with well over 40 states to look at policy changes, that has worked hard to teach the teachers so that many of the teachers in high school and middle school can teach students about computing. CS for All is a program that's a consortium for Department of Education and resource providers to provide computing as a discipline. And there's many school districts, the Chicago school system, the New York school system, the Texas school system, that have had really significant changes in terms of bringing the ideas of computing to all high school students. And then there's all these after-school programs like Girls Who Code, Black Girls Who Code, the National Center for Women in IT Aspirations Award. It's really, it's bringing the concepts of computing to a much broader group of people. And you ask, I'm obviously focused on women, but you need to understand that most of these programs are for all people. What we really want is to have everybody have exposure to computer science when they're in high school, so that they can make an informed decision, like all of you, as to, is this a real possibility for me? Just to give you one example, I'd like to introduce you to Amy Lynn. I serve on the board of AI for All. It's a summer camp, and she had no exposure to AI. But in 2015, she attended one of the summer camps and remained involved with some of the research while in high school. Went to the NIPS conference, and one of the workshops there won the Best Paper Award, and will enter in the fall to study AI. There's many Amy's. There's all kinds of kids all over the world, all over the country, that are exposed to technology and what makes it possible. I want to talk a bit about what universities are doing. It's very important to be systematic in changing. Well, one of the good news is that Michigan is really at the forefront in terms of thinking about these kinds of topics. As I've gone through today and talked to many of the faculty and student advisors, there's an unusual focus on trying to create a more inclusive class. And you are the beneficiaries of that focus. Just to give you some examples of what universities are doing, these are best in class. These are universities that have made changes from 2006 to 2015. You can see that they've changed in women, Hispanics, African American. University of Michigan, for example, was 9% in 2006. That's the percentage of women that were graduating, and it went up to 21%. MIT, for example, went up to 34%. Harvey Mudd College, which has gotten a lot of coverage in terms of its work on bringing more of computer science to more students, is up to 40%. This is all based on the IPEDS data that I mentioned earlier. But what's important, and my message to you is, we know how to create change. We know what to do. And these are examples of universities that are making those changes, that are making the commitment. What can universities do? There's a program called Braid that's a partnership between Harvey Mudd College and the Anita Borg Institute. And there are 4 commitments that these 15 universities have agreed to do. The 4 commitments are to look at the introductory to computer science class, because students are coming in with very different experience before coming to college. And so if you segregate based on programming experience and you make that introduction class fun, it attracts a broader set of people. And I know that Michigan is doing some work in this area, so I think that that's important. There's also outreach to high schools. I mentioned Ashley, who's done a lot of work at DePauw of reaching out to local high schools. The people here know a lot about what's possible with technology, and so reaching out to the local high schools, bringing them in, can make a huge difference. Developing community and through taking cohorts to Grace Hopper Celebration or to the Richard Tapia Conference of Celebration of Diversity. And these are ways that universities are making a difference. And then finally, looking at joint majors, we have observed that joint majors are more attractive to a broader set of people. Just to give you some data from Braid, we have a research team at UCLA, and they've been measuring this since there's this huge influx of students in computer science. But of the 15 schools that are participating in Braid, they have, whereas the men that are coming into the program, and once again, this is not graduation data, this is enrollment data. The men have increased by 26%, the women have increased by 50%. Within, you see once again some difference in terms of racial diversity, that whites have increased by about 23%, as have blacks, but the Hispanics have increased by about 35% in that same time. So by adhering to these commitments, we are seeing changes within these universities. And I know I'm going a little bit fast, but I wanted to talk a bit about what companies can do, because I believe that there's some things that we can learn in terms of how companies are creating change. Once again, my message to you is that we know what to do. We know how to create change. There are ideas out there, and what you measure, you will change. And there's 4 areas that I have seen be effective at companies. 1, to hold leaders accountable. 2, to evaluate the diversity programs. 3, to diagnose bias in promotion. And 4, to work with everybody. So let's start with holding leaders accountable. There are companies whose CEOs speak publicly about wanting to create change. They then hold their leadership accountable. They have goals that they measure. Similarly, in academics, the Braid institutions that I mentioned, one of the key aspects of people who are engaged with Braid is that we have the computer science department chair involved. That they, as a leader of the department, they're the ones that can hold the rest of the department accountable. To give you just one example, Intel is in many ways the gold standard of a company that has created change. Now, I come from the semiconductor industry. The Intel that I grew up with was very in your face. Women didn't belong. And they have systematically changed their culture. And it's a good example of what is possible. Brian Krasenich, their CEO, talks publicly, frequently about the importance of diversity. He has a staff that works with him on it. He holds his direct reports. Part of their bonuses are tied to diversity goals. Intel publishes a diversity report twice a year. And they talk about what's working. They talk about what's not working. They deploy programs in places where they see places where they're losing people. And I'll talk a bit more about that in just a minute. So it's really important that leaders are accountable for change. The second is that you need to evaluate your programs and make sure that they're actually having the impact that you want to have. Many, in my world, in my business, you see a lot of diversity programs. And people at universities, at companies, there's a couple of people that say, I think this is a great idea, and they go and they start these activities. And I'm a fan of passion. It's what has served me well. But everything that you do means that you're not doing something else. And so you want to make sure that the places that you're investing really make a difference. The Harvard Business Review did a really nice analysis of programs in diversity that made a difference. And the way that they measured it was by the change in managers. So they had a very simple measure that over 5 years, whether or not this program resulted in change. Many of the programs that many companies do as a matter of course, according to this study, and this in an article called Why Diversity Fails, don't work. So mandatory diversity training is one example. Many places are doing especially mandatory bias training. And training for everybody just doesn't make any significant difference over time unless you back it up with something else. You can see some of the other things that they show didn't help. Grievance systems, tests. But what this article also talks about is what does work. And this is programs that actually made a significant difference over the course of 5 years. And all the programs in this article talked about, it's where they engage with the population. So diversity task forces. So this is where the companies are working with the employees to figure out what should we do. Looking at where you recruit. If you go to the same old places to recruit, you're going to get the same people that you've been getting. So my advice is that you need to think carefully about whether or not any particular program works. I mentioned Intel a few minutes ago. They had a program that trained their technical workforce that were on the path to becoming a fellow in how to present your ideas, because they had found that for the broad set of people who were principal engineers, this was a skill that was lacking. And being Intel, they measured what an impact that it had. Last year, they had 4 more women fellows in 1 year, which was unheard of. And it's a small number, but it makes a huge difference. But this idea of deploying programs and then measuring their impact is really important. So the next important point is to diagnose bias in your promotion. I talked about bias training. It doesn't work. Training by itself doesn't work. But if you take those same concepts and you apply it to how you promote, it can make a huge difference. When I first started working with GoDaddy, people laughed at me because they had this terrible reputation for women. They had these ads that featured scantily clad women. My board was horrified. The women, people would just roll their eyes. But GoDaddy had a new CEO, and they were very committed to creating change. They started by looking at where they recruit, and they came to the Grace Hopper celebration. They went about recruiting a lot more diverse employees. They had groups where these employees could connect. This picture is the CEO, Blake Irving, at the Grace Hopper celebration, where he was openly talking about their compensation study. You've got to understand that the entire audience was very negative about him as he walked out on the stage. But he was systematic in the way that they went about looking at how they compensated people and how they made the change. And by the end of the talk, he had the entire audience eating out of his hand. As they looked at promotion, what they did was they went back to basic principles and looked at how, the evaluation criteria for how people were promoted, and they widely publicized that so that all employees knew that there was a fair plate of which they were being evaluated. They made sure that every employee got their day in court. They got feedback. You knew that the whole process was fair. They piloted promotion flags, which meant that they informed managers that their employees were up for promotion. And really what you want to see here is that they defined a rigorous process that was fair for everybody, and they stuck to it. So the managers were not doing it based on style or some of the things that can lead to bias. And in just a few years, they had a 4% increase in women in their top performers, which is significant for just a year or two. And then last but not least, we all want to work together. So I talked about the potential for technology. We want everybody in this room to be in a seat in the technology creation. As we look at having more women at the table creating technology, we want to engage with everyone. Women, men, all people. It is better for all of us if we are working together on creating a diverse set of people, creating this technology. And here's the truth. If you look at the power structure, the people who are in the decision-making positions today, often, consciously or not, they do not want change. It's working for them. In Silicon Valley, there's this myth of meritocracy that goes down to the Silicon Valley core, and it is just not true. The people who believe in meritocracy are the people who have benefited from the current system. But all of you have the potential to change that. That for every moment, as you live about your life, if you reach out to all people that you work with, as you're running a meeting, you make sure that everybody is heard. If you see a young student of either gender who's new in the program, you sit down and have coffee with them, and you share your experience, strength, and hope. You can make a difference. And I can guarantee you that if you really take the time and you participate in this new world of technology where we're all coming together, that we can and will change the world. And I tell you that we know how to create cultures where women thrive, where all people thrive. And if you just take a moment to be part of that different future, we will find technology that will have a positive impact on everything that we do. So thank you. And I understand we're going to take questions. So.
Yes, we can take questions, and if you have some question, come down, and there are microphones here in the front.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was very enlightening. One concern that I have when companies talk about how they want to promote diversity is that can give an impression that the women they hire thereafter are there as the token women. They're there They're there as the token women. They're there to improve that number so that they'll be above the average line and the company looks good. And that can have negative effects both in terms of coworkers assuming that, oh, don't listen to her, she's just there to be the woman. And in terms of, as a woman, increasing the sense of imposter syndrome. And I wonder if you have thought about ways to avoid that consequence while encouraging diversity.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's interesting because I've been asked this a lot since I've been here, so it's certainly a theme that is around here. Here's the thing. The companies or the universities would not be hiring you if they didn't believe and know that you could do the job. When you look at changing a system, you are going to break some of the norms about the way that you approach things. And I think it's important as women enter these new positions and they hear these stories that they have enough connection and support that they can laugh. I mean, this is really more about the person saying that than it is about them. And so it is one of the reasons why it's important to have people that you can talk to. It's the slide that I had about the power structure, and that there are existing power structures, and as things change, it's going to feel a bit uncomfortable, and that's just a fact of life. But know that you would not be hired if the people hiring you did not believe that you could do the job.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm a PhD student in computer science, and this is the scenario I've heard about over and over again when I talk to multiple other female PhDs in this field, that we know that in current class there's still a majority of men, and only a few of women feel like they feel the pressure to stay behind when their male peers keep raising their hand, asking questions, participating in discussions. They just feel like they have the pressure to stay quiet, and because they might not feel comfortable to join that kind of culture. So I kind of wonder, do you have any suggestions to professors or to students how we can improve this situation? Thank you.
Sure, and I do believe, this is an issue, much like the former question, that especially as things change, there's going to be some discomfort. It is important for the professors to hear this. So for those of you in the room who are professors or lecturers, be aware that it's in your best interest and some of your students' best interests if you make it a point to call on a diverse set of people in your room to make sure that all voices are heard. Because by calling on some of the people in the room, that then encourages other people to raise your hand. But I also then go back to each of us has our own journey. So certainly for me, when I've sat through classes being completely quiet and I didn't ask the question, which I really wanted to ask. I've gone afterwards and I've gone to my coach, which are often just people, my peers, and I talked about the situation. And so the next class, I'm determined to ask a question. And sometimes it's a little awkward, but I raise my hand and I ask the question. Or in my case today, often I'll be in an advisory board meeting and I will force myself to speak up because all the people in the room are talking over each other and they're not giving a chance for me to speak up. So by practicing, I often then create change. But it takes practice, and it is both you as a student and also your fellow students. You know, it's perfectly okay for you to raise your hand and say, I believe that Jane over here has a question. So help each other, but also for the faculty to realize that you want to make sure that to go the extra mile to call on lots of different people in your classes, not just the ones who talk a lot.
Hello, hi, I'm Chad Jenkins. I'm faculty in computer science and robotics. Could you speak to the economic incentives that drive the current system and that would be associated with the accountability that you've mentioned? If you're willing to do it also, I'd also like your perspective on the impact of Title IX that you may have seen.
The impact of what? The economic?
Also the impact of Title IX. On the university and how you've seen that apply to computer science.
So economic incentives, you mean like the time bonuses for the executives?
So the overall impact. So a company has to make money. That is the bottom line in the end.
Okay.
How do you have accountability in that context?
So there's a lot of social science that shows that companies that have a broader set of representation typically also have better return on investments. I mean, and they can only measure public data, but more women on boards, more women in executive leadership. You can't say it's causal, but it tends to come with companies that also, they have better economic return. As you look at creating change for diversity, you can't, I mean, leaders can't take their eye off the business returns. But so it's really marrying diversity to their business returns and making it part of those. Otherwise, it feels completely orthogonal. But there is a lot of social science that says that the returns are better. You know, Title IX, I mean, first of all, just the fact that Title IX exists has been really helpful for all of us. We haven't seen as many lawsuits about Title IX for technology workforce as you do like in sports. But that might change. I know that when I was at NSF a number of years ago, that there was a lot of talk about applying Title IX more broadly, and I'd love to see more of that.
Hi, Dr. Whitney. Thank you for being here. So I had a couple of questions, if that's all right. The first question, at the end of your talk here, you mentioned meritocracy in Silicon Valley. For people who really strongly believe in that, if you had time to just give like an elevator pitch to someone, because this was a great presentation, but you know, if you just had like a minute with somebody, what would your address be to them if the topic came up? And my second question was about the different strategies for increasing diversity, and we looked at like the measurements. How are they able to isolate the results that come from each of those different methods and changing recruiting if a lot of them are, because I assume a lot of them are being used by a company?
Sure. The meritocracy is interesting. So I'm reading a great book. Those of you who are interested in the argument for meritocracy, it's called Brotopia. It's by Emily Chang, who comes a reporter out of Bloomberg. And she goes through in excruciating detail Silicon Valley and how it was started and why it was not a meritocracy, and those that talk about it. But in a nutshell, most startups hire from their network. And they are hiring people that look like them. They are basing what they call meritocracy on what they would do. And so it's not, and so if you, for anybody who doesn't look like them, you have a very difficult time navigating their system. That's true in startups. The particular example that she goes through is what they call the PayPal mafia, which includes Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and a number of others that came together, and they all hired their friends. And they were very successful in that first one. They went on to populate many other startup ventures, and it was definitely not a meritocracy. They all hired the people they knew. My own experience is that I was in a very successful internet company a number of years ago, where the head of engineering would say, I believe in our culture, we're a complete meritocracy, we just need more women. And I happen to know at this company that the women, there had been a confidential survey, and all the women at this company did not for a second believe that it was a meritocracy. They felt like people who were promoted who looked like the people in power. But in Silicon Valley, this is a deeply held myth, so it's hard to punch through it. Okay, so what was your second question? How do you measure programs' impact, right? Yeah, individual. So as you look at, is when you deploy a program, I do believe it's important to think about the metrics. The one that I mentioned at Intel, they were training the pipeline going up to fellows to become fellows, and so it was pretty clear that you could measure the number of people who were, principal engineer and then went on to become fellows. So it's usually pretty clear what to measure, but you need to think about it at the beginning. This is why it's important for somebody to be looking at things in aggregate. In a company, that's often the CEO and the head of diversity that's really managing the portfolio of activities. At a university, that's why Braid is so important to have the department chair be part of the program, because that's the person that can help look at the aggregate of activities. I see for a number of companies that individual people start programs and they can measure how, in isolation, how well their program is doing, but it's harder to look at aggregate because, once again, anything that you're doing means that you're not doing something else. That's what people forget, is that you really are always making choices. Yes?
How do you think the Me Too movement and recent allegations of sexual harassment in Silicon Valley are going to change this conversation? So it seems like it might push companies to have better HR practices and better reporting practices, but it might also push women away from Silicon Valley.
Yeah. So I'm so excited about Me Too. There's never been this movement where people speak up and say, this is my truth. Silicon Valley is a big place, and so most of what you've seen, the news about Me Too, is in startups. It's Ellen Pao, her story, which is remarkable. It's some of the female founders, and there's still very few women in this whole startup ecosystem. That's a very different ecosystem than the bigger companies, the Amazons, Intels, Facebook, Google, which have big HR, they have big diversity efforts, but here's the truth. We haven't yet seen that whole Me Too movement break into the technology companies truly. I mean, Uber's the one example of with Susan Fowler where we have started to see it. But there is, I mean, many of these companies have employees that leave sign non-disclosure agreements. So they can't talk about it. It's the same thing that you're seeing all over the news with Trump. That also happens in the technology industry, but it's not all over the news. And so I think that there's more to come. At least I'm hopeful there's more to come. But for you, as a graduating student, what I would, my message more than anything else is there is huge variance in companies. So you want to ask a lot of questions as you interview to know if the place that you're going to has a culture where you can thrive.
Hi.
Hi.
So considering politically divisive events like last summer's Google memo debacle, what do you think should be done to foster diversity of thought while also maintaining a healthy work environment, particularly within companies?
Right. I mean, not surprisingly, there's actually a pretty big backlash right now. And companies have gotten so focused on the topic of diversity that they have forgotten that really what they want is to promote all diversity. It has become synonymous with more women, more representation for different minorities. And I actually think that even Google knows that they, messed up is probably, I mean, the way they handled that situation didn't help them solve their problem, because anybody who feels like they have a different perspective than the norm now believes that they can't speak up. And in the same way that the person who asked about the woman who feels like they got the job, and the people around her are saying she's a woman, you've now got people at companies that feel like they can't speak up. I mean, these are two sides of the same issue of being able to create cultures where everybody's voice is heard. And whereas I say that we know how to change diversity, I'm not sure we know how to create cultures yet where everybody feels like they can speak. And to be honest, maybe universities can take a leadership role. Maybe University of Michigan can take a leadership role, because it's a place of academic excellence where the whole point is that all voices are heard. So, academic may be able to teach industry on this front.
So I would like to ask one last question.
Sure.
So you outlined a number of initiatives and activities that have helped a lot in increasing the participation of women, right? I saw data that has brought significant change in the last decade, I would say. Why is that those same activity had such a smaller impact on racial minorities?
On underrepresented minorities?
Yes.
Yeah.
What else could we do to improve on that dimension too?
Well, part of the issue that we see with underrepresented minorities is that they're smaller in number. And so we see less impact. But I serve on the board of something called the Center for Minorities and People with Disabilities. And it's important. What I've learned a lot in my board role. And it's important to have targeted programs. That if you are an African American student, if you don't have, there's just much smaller numbers, and so you need to have some exposure to somebody else that looks like you. This is kind of a story in negative, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Google systematically went out and brought, I think, 50 students from Howard University and hired them. And within a year, all of them were gone. And they didn't know. They've since revamped the program, and I actually think that their subsequent numbers were much better. It was part of the learning process, but it's recognized that if you, like for everybody, if you try and bring people into an existing culture, it isn't necessarily going to work. You really have to think about the overall infrastructure and how, especially when you're creating change that's brand new, you need to figure out how to make it work, especially during the transition.
Thank you, Telle. There is one last thing we need to do before you clap.
Well, you can clap for me, right? I really want to thank Dr. Whitney for joining us today and sharing these thoughts with us. And one of the themes that you heard a lot in that talk, and a lot of what these things boil down to, is cultural change. And cultural change requires the participation of many, many, many people. So one of the challenges I'd like to leave for you is for each and every single one of you, what can you do in the next week to make Michigan a more welcoming place for everybody around you? So carry that forward with you. And we'd also like to present the memento of this talk to Dr. Whitney, a great talk that
Oh, wow.
the moment. And thank you so much.
Oh,
We
thank
so
you.
appreciate you for coming.
Thank you, that's beautiful. Can I give a hug?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Photo picture?
Sure.
Good.
Thanks.
And I'd also like to welcome the faculty and close friends of the department to join us for a reception in Leicester after this concludes. And thank you so much for